Joining us now is, in my opinion, the world's foremost expert on the JFK assassination. He is the author of the preeminent book on the subject, Case Closed. He is Gerald Posner. Gerald, welcome back to the Death of Journalism podcast.
John, great to be with you again.
I have been waiting for this for a very long time. You and I last spoke around the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. And due to several scheduling issues, we've never been able to put it together. But now we have, and hopefully have a little bit of time to get into some of the topics that I want to discuss. But first, before I get into some of the stuff that we may disagree on, I want to talk about what we agree on, and specifically the most recent developments with regard to the unveiling, I guess, of the so-called JFK files. And it's I'm pretty confident that you and I are on the same page here, that we believed that this would be a big nothing burger, and that what was really motivating this was a deep desire, especially among MAGA world and Trump fans, to prove the existence of a deep state. And that if a deep state had in fact assassinated JFK, then it was far easier for people to believe that they had stolen an election from Donald Trump in 2020. Now that we know what is allegedly in these files, were we correct in that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's still a sort of a view on the hard MAGA group that there is a conspiracy here. Representative Luna, who ran the select committee hearings, certainly believes that. I think she's representative of the view that, and I'm using an overgeneralization here, but a lot of hardcore Trump supporters just don't trust the deep state. And that doesn't just go for Trump voters. It goes, it extends out to the middle and to the left as well. They believe that election was stolen. And as a result, you're absolutely right. They're looking for the early evidence to be able to say, look, the deep state, they're really nefarious. They're terrible. As a matter of fact, they're always working against the best interests of the country. They even assassinated a president back in 1963. So how can we expect anything different along this way? And I think that's why there was such an effort to make something out of the files. In the end, the files, I've been through all of them, and I know that some decent journalists who should know better have tried their very, very best to make the most out of them, to sort of put a square peg into a round hole and say there's really something here. I smell the CIA on Oswald's trail. I think they might be using him and manipulating him. None of the files, and I think that you'll agree on this, John, changed the conclusion that Oswald was the person on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. He was the one who carried out the assassination. He was doing it for his own warped motivations, not for any intelligence agency or anything else. So that, we have a lot of smoke and there's distractions and everything else, but there's nothing in those files that fundamentally changes the conclusion about the case of Oswald having killed the president.
And I agree with you in 100% that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin of JFK. It was your book, Case Closed, which firmly convinced me of that many years ago. However, we have a potential disagreement on how Oswald actually committed this crime, or the logistics of this crime. And before we get into the specifics of our disagreements on the single bullet theory, I want to just kind of pick your brain a little bit on whether or not you agree with my assessment as to why the single bullet theory is so important. It's not just about proving that Oswald was in fact the assassin. It is my strong opinion, Gerald, that the main reason, there are many others, but the main reason why conspiracy theories run so rampant in this case is the single bullet theory, regardless of whether or not it's true, whether or not that's the right way to explain how Oswald did it. Do you agree, Gerald, that the single bullet theory has been an epic failure with regard to preventing conspiracy theories from cropping up in the JFK assassination?
Absolutely. I think that's right. I mean, the only thing that I think has contributed more to conspiracy fervor and speculation and lack of belief is Jack Ruby's murder of Oswald. So, take away Ruby's murder of Oswald. You have the person who's arrested for killing the president killed 2 days later by a guy who looks like he's out of central casting for the mafia. So you're often running on conspiracies. And then you have the Warren Commission. Really, as you know so well, they can't figure it out any other way. So David Belin comes up with a theory, and it was only a theory because they couldn't prove it, that this one bullet inflicted, the same set of wounds on the governor and the president. And it's been ridiculed over the years. Oliver Stone does the best possible job of ridiculing it in JFK. As the bullet does a somersault, takes a left turn, takes a right turn, takes a vacation for a few seconds, and then goes on to hit the governor. And so, I think, and we will talk about our difference on this, but I've always said that I make the case for why I believe ballistics have established the single bullet as a fact. But even if I'm right, assume for a second that I was right on this, and that one bullet inflicted those wounds, and it happened as the Warren Commission thought. It doesn't tell you what happened in the assassination. It just tells you that one shot fired from behind Kennedy that day inflicted that set of wounds on those two men. Now, you don't know how many other shots were fired. You don't know when the fatal shot was fired. You don't know the direction of it. You don't know if there was one or two assassins. You don't know who the assassin was. You don't know if there was a conspiracy. But so many people invest all their time into the single bullet. They think that if I make the case that the single bullet was right, I'm therefore making the case for a single assassin, and I'm not. You have to go much further. That's the first step. I always thought that if the single bullet was false, if I was able to establish that it was false at Dealey Plaza, then you had very strong evidence of a conspiracy, unless all three shots hit the men, which I don't think they did. So
see, that's where you and I that's where you and I differ, because I don't think you need the single bullet theory to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And you said something just now that really surprised me, and I want to get more information on this, because you're giving the single bullet theory credit to someone other than Arlen Specter. And I'm curious as to why you're not giving Specter the credit, because history seemingly has said that Arlen Specter, who would end up being a senator from Pennsylvania, who was a lawyer on the Warren Commission, was the guy who came up with that theory. So why not Arlen Specter? What am I missing here?
It is Specter. You're right. Specter's the one who comes up with it, but it's a theory. And,
okay, but I'm going to ask, Gerald, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we have a limited time, so I want to make sure I get to as many of these points as possible. I'm going to raise an issue that I'm going to bet, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, no one has ever raised with you in all the thousands of interviews that you have done about this situation. The first time I started to seriously question the single bullet theory, because I attributed it to Arlen Specter, came during the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton. When Arlen Specter, you probably remember this, somehow figured out a way to vote not proven, citing Scottish law. Now, that to me was so absurd and so idiotic, but more importantly than being idiotic, it was an indication of a brain that Arlen Specter has, that he was very prone to reverse engineering his thinking, that he has a conclusion he needs to get to, and he thinks he's the smartest man in the room, and he's going to contrive a way to get to that conclusion, and he's willing to do absurd things like cite Scottish law to vote Bill Clinton not proven in an impeachment trial. At that moment, I lost all faith in Arlen Specter, because the single bullet theory felt reverse engineered to me as an investigator. What is your assessment of whether that's a legitimate way of thinking about Arlen Specter?
I'd forgotten that about the Clinton impeachment. You could absolutely be right on that, John. And so, here's my view on Specter and the single bullet. He could have reverse engineered it. He could have been on a binge drunk spell. He wasn't a drinker, but let's say he was, and come up with a single bullet one night because he thought it was a clever idea. No matter how baseless his idea was about the single bullet, the real question is whether it's right or wrong. And it takes failure analysis and ballistics experts 30 years, right, before they do it the year before. No luck of mine that happened, but it was done before I published Case Closed. Their work is what convinced me that, guess what, the FBI inspector, they didn't know what was going on, because they didn't realize how the bullets slowed up as they went through the men. They just thought it was at full speed. And so Specter got lucky, no question about it. Single bullet theory could have been false. And if it was false, then we'd be saying, okay, what else happened? But I'm convinced that single bullet theory becomes a fact based upon the 1992 ballistics and failure analysis work.
Okay, well, let's get into the actual details of this. So the last time, I doubt you remember this because you do so many interviews, but the last time we spoke on the record, I put forward my theory, which frankly is a lot more consistent with Occam's razor. It's much simpler. My theory is that JFK gets hit in the back with the now referred to as pristine magic bullet. Connelly gets hit with the second shot, and the third shot blows off Kennedy's head. And I have explanations for everything, I believe, related to that. You said, I believe, almost a direct quote, that your major problem with my theory is James Teague. James Teague is the person who was cited by the Warren Commission as having been hit by a fragment from the first shot. Do you recall?
So if I said that when we talked last time on the record, then I'm going to modify it this time, because my major problem with your layout is that the reaction time for Kennedy and Connelly when they're struck by a bullet is an 18th of a second. And that's not just me saying it. It's the enhancement, the digital enhancement, the Zapruder film.
Yeah, I don't believe that. I mean, I don't believe that, and I would like to address that. But before we get to that, because I'm going to get to all of it as long as we can do it in the time we have allotted, I want to talk about James Teague first, because I am astonished. Forget about, I want to make very clear, you may be right about the single bullet theory, okay? I am not 100% committed to any theory. I'm trying to figure out what the truth is, and I think you're the best guy to talk to try to figure out the truth. And I even have a solution, which I'm going to pose to you at the end of this interview. But the James Teague aspect of this, to me, is absolutely mind-blowing. That the Warren Commission claims that a guy who was not even in the newspaper the next day, who was never in any of the initial reports, who only had a cut on his cheek, who was located nowhere near where the limo was when that first shot was fired, whenever it was. And frankly, to me, was far closer to the limousine when the third shot was fired than the first shot.
Right, at a sharp angle.
Right. Would you agree, Gerald, that at the very least, the evidence that James Teague was shot by or was hit by a fragment of a bullet is remarkably weak, considering the amount of investigation into this case? Would you acknowledge that?
You don't know what happened to that bullet. You're absolutely right. Just as, let's say for a second, both of these ways, John. If I'm right and the first bullet misses, so it's the sharpest angle, it gets deflected by something, maybe the tree. We don't know. I'm speculating because they never sent a cherry picker up there and went through that tree to look at it. It goes out somewhere in the depository, and we lose that bullet, essentially. But the same thing happens if you're right and Kennedy's, struck by the first bullet, what you call CE 399 found on the stretcher at Parkland, and Connelly's hit by another bullet. Where's that bullet? That's the real magic bullet.
Well, Connelly has fragments in his body, as you know.
The fragments are a fraction.
Okay, but let me just take this one step at a time. So in my opinion, what we're being asked to believe by the Warren Commission, and this is a key part of the single bullet theory, because you have to explain, because you're only explaining two shots in the single bullet theory, the one that goes through JFK, and it's Connelly, and the one that blows off JFK's head. So you need a missed shot. And this is where I go to our inspector contriving this reverse engineered situation. I am not convinced that there's enough evidence that Teague wasn't just hit with maybe debris from the third shot, maybe even a bone fragment. You acknowledge that that's possible, right?
Possible.
Okay. So there's all sorts of reasons why Teague would have had a cut on his face. I mean, he just experienced the most traumatic event of his lifetime. And there's no evidence that he immediately says, "Oh my God, I've been shot." There's nothing like that. And
he wasn't shot, and he wasn't shot. Even if he was hit by a piece of flying, little speck of concrete that cut his face, he wasn't shot.
Right. Okay, but he's not part of the initial reporting in the case. And so, but I also want to take this from Oswald's perspective, Gerald. And you, I think, understand Oswald better than anybody else who studied this case. So I want your opinion on the psychology of this. This has always very much bothered me from a human standpoint. So Oswald earlier that year tries to assassinate General Walker. He fires one shot and misses and runs away like a scared little schoolgirl. Okay, that's a fair assessment, correct?
He hit him, runs away in victory, thinks he hit him, and it Walker's down.
Okay, but we're being
take another shot.
All right. Well, we're being asked to here's what we're being asked to believe about Oswald. He's sitting up there in the 6th floor of the school book depository building, and he waits and he waits and he waits for the limousine to turn the corner, and he fires that first shot, and he doesn't just miss JFK. He doesn't just miss the limo. He doesn't just miss the street. Allegedly he hits the pavement, although there's no evidence in the Zapruder film of a pavement being hit. There's no evidence that I've seen that's conclusive that the pavement was ever hit. That is a catastrophic miss by any imagination, right? That is a catastrophic miss. That's unbelievably missed.
John, you're making a big assumption, though. You're assuming that Oswald knows he missed the car. You're assuming that he realized he missed entirely. How would he know that? Bear with me a second. Think of this. This 23, just turned 24-year-old kid has to decide how he's going to take the shots. So he's going to take the shots as the car's coming toward him. No, he decides not to do that because, of course, that would expose him to all the buildings, including the Dow Techs to the left of him. So he decides to take it after it's made its turn. Now think of, everybody forgets about this. He is shooting at the president of the United States in a moving motorcade with Jackie Kennedy next to him, Secret Service there, Connelly with his Texas, that cowboy hat, Mrs. Connelly next to him. His heart has to be, the adrenaline has to be pumping. Now he takes not a practice shot. This isn't a shot that he's ever taken before. It's the sharpest angle. It's at a sharp 120 degrees down. He's holding that rifle down because that's where the car is when it first passes through. And he takes that shot. His heart has to be beating through. And he doesn't hit Kennedy as far as he can see, but he doesn't know if he's hit somebody else in the car.
But that is a catastrophic miss, Gerald. That is
his target. But then he has 3.5 seconds. And he's got to recock, aim again, and take the next shot, which he does. He could have just fled.
Like okay, but Gerald
could have thrown the rifle down and left, but he takes it, and guess what? It's not fatal. Again, he hits his target, but Kennedy's going to survive that. Now the entire assassination is going to go down the drain, except Lee is able to take the next 5 seconds, and the driver of the car slows it up enough for him to be able to get the shot that almost misses entirely, but hits a high rear right portion of the skull, 1.25 inches higher. He misses entirely, but he pulls it off by that matter, and that's how close that assassination is to failing, like the Walker assassination.
But Gerald, I actually think you're making my argument for me, because you are making an argument that seems so counter to common sense and the way human beings would respond. How is the first shot a catastrophic miss, but he gathers himself to fire 2 shots, one that hits, in your view, Kennedy in the neck, and the next blows off his head, all in the midst of this chaos going on? That seems incomprehensible to me from a human standpoint.
And John, I have a question for you. Where
Please.
is the magic bullet of your second shot that hits Connelly?
Well, hold on a second. I've already
stolen? Did somebody steal it?
Well, there's first of all, bullets disappear all the time, Gerald, in crime cases. You know that, but there are fragments within Connelly's body.
But those fragments are less than the amount missing from the so-called pristine bullet. By the way, which is a misnomer, as you know. To call it the pristine bullet is like saying somebody's almost pregnant. A woman's either pregnant or she's not. That bullet, I've examined it in person. The actual CE 399 in Washington. It's not a pristine bullet.
Okay, it's not pristine, but it doesn't look like it's gone through several bones. It does not look that way, Gerald. You know that.
Exactly like the way that failure analysis and other ballistics experts now have reproduced. You've seen, John, in my book, I reproduce a bullet that's fired into 2 carcasses, the size and weight of the governor and the president from the distance.
Does it look like the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head, Gerald?
No, it looks exactly like the second bullet.
No. Gerald, answer my question. Does 399 look anything like the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head?
No, that's the direct on skull shot. Of course not. It looks like it should. 399 looks like the bullet that's now reproduced all day long because it hits Kennedy without hitting any bone,
which is not possible.
Well, but you're okay. So, John, I respect you on a lot of things in the Kennedy assassination. And I am willing to look at evidence to change my mind, but your mind is closed when it comes to
No. Well, hold on. My mind is incredibly open. My mind is,
and it's entertaining. It's like a food fight,
Gerald,
and it's great and everything else. But I'm not going to change your mind because you're
Gerald,
not being changed.
Gerald, you can absolutely change my mind, but you absolutely can. Let me prove it to you. Let me prove it,
what about
Gerald.
The bullets going up, John? Let me ask you about that. You don't believe that?
Don't believe what?
What I have as when I show that from failure analysis, you don't believe that that bullet slowed up as it went through the two men?
Um,
No, because you don't think it went through.
how much could a bullet slow down and
But
still go and hold on and still go through numerous points of Connelly's body ending
no,
up in his thigh? How could that possibly
no,
even
no.
work? If the
It's
bullet slowed down, it wouldn't get through Connelly's body.
no, that's wrong. 11 to
Okay.
1,200 feet a second, it hits the rib, hits to the side. That's what flattens the bullet out. And when it goes into the wrist,
Okay.
John, this isn't a theory. This is what
Okay.
they reproduce in terms of ballistics all day long now. 900 feet a second, enough to shatter the bone and doesn't affect the bullet.
Why would shattering a bone
because
not impact the bullet, Gerald? Explain that.
950 feet with that 165 grain
Okay.
full metal jacketed bullet, when fired at a lower load of 950 feet, it breaks bone consistently and comes out unscathed. 950 feet enough to break the
Okay.
bone, not to form the bullet.
You said something in your description there of where you believe the so-called magic bullet hit Kennedy, which is one of my many major problems with the single bullet theory. And you pointed to the back of your neck, and you there's two problems with what I believe you just did, because your theory seems to be that the bullet hits Kennedy in the neck kind of from the side, so it somehow misses his vertebrae, yet goes through the throat, which, if that's the case, in order to get that kind of an angle, that is going as far away from Connelly as you can possibly get. It's going way to the left of Connelly, given where the limousine was positioned at that time. You disagree with that?
No, with all due respect, as a matter of fact, that's what convinced me of the fact that the single bullet happened.
But it's way too far to the left of Connelly at that point, Gerald, the direction of the bullet.
We know where they're hit now because of something that happened on Connelly. And I don't know if you've seen this, and that is we discovered
the lapel.
His lapel flies up.
Yeah.
And you go back and you check his suit, and guess what? That's where the bullet hole is on him. Whether you think it's your a single bullet that hit him, whether it's the single bullet that I'm talking about. So now you know when Connelly's hit, when Kennedy's hit an 18th of a second before. That's the speed of the bullet.
We hold on.
224 and 225. You know where they are in the car. Connelly's lower. You recreate with the computer whether it's a straight line or not. If it's not a straight line, guess what? Case closed. No single bullet. It's a straight line. Now that doesn't tell you that that's how it happened, but it tells you that that's at that point. There's no dodge, no turn, nothing else. That's just the straight evidence on it.
Well, except that it contradicts John Connelly's own testimony and the testimony of his wife.
We talked about this. Connelly had my manuscript, and I was hopeful that Connelly was going to change his mind. The big headline coming out of the publication of Case Closed, that John Connelly was going to say, after 30 years, that I have changed my mind on the bullet that hit me. That was going to be the headline news. He died. That manuscript was in his case. His secretary told me he was reading that manuscript. He got into the hospital. He was sick. He never made it back with a blurb, but we were hoping from Random House, but Connelly was actually going to endorse that book. And that's
but for the record, it did not happen. And that's not your fault, but it didn't happen. But I want to go back to the position. The positioning of the so-called neck wound is incredibly important to me, because not only do I have a problem with the direction that because you have a problem. The problem is that there's no damage to Kennedy's vertebrae, and so therefore it has to somehow miss his vertebrae and then go through the throat. But that to me creates a very problematic angle. But there's a bigger problem.
Not at all.
The bigger problem is we have the autopsy photos, we have the autopsy sketch, and we have Kennedy's shirt and jacket. And as you well know, but I'm very eager to hear your explanation for it, all of those things I just cited indicate that the hole from behind Kennedy is nowhere near his neck. It's in his back. It's absolutely unambiguously in his back. It's in his upper right portion of his back. So how do you get all this evidence that shows that the hole in Kennedy's back is not in the neck where you need it to be? How do you explain that?
Maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, so I look at what's the best evidence. I don't look at all the evidence and get confused by it and run down one path and then another path and then down this alley and then hit myself against the wall. I look for the best evidence. So if the only evidence that was available, we had nothing else at all but Kennedy's clothing, then we would all say, gee, that bullet hole was lower, because we don't realize that he had a back brace on and that you could see where the jacket is bunched up and that the jacket and shirt are bunched up. So that's not necessarily the best evidence. But if it was the only evidence, that's what we'd have to rely on. Then guess what? We have a drawing from the autopsy. take it by memory and put down on a piece of paper. If that was the only evidence we had, or it was the evidence combined with the clothing, we'd say that bullet hole was lower. But guess what the best evidence is? As a lawyer, I know this. You have an accident, 10 people are witnessing it. They describe different colors, different speeds, who was driving, and everything else. I don't care if they all say the car was red. If you have a video of that accident and the car was blue, I'm going to go with the best evidence and say that car was blue. In this case, the autopsy photos are the best evidence.
But the photo shows a hole where the autopsy sketch shows there was a hole.
Maybe photos that you've seen on the internet, maybe photos that you've seen reproduced in books. But if you get access through the National Archives to see those photos in person, you examine them as I have with a forensic pathologist like Michael Bodden, they will show you exactly that hole. Leaves no doubt that the bunched clothing is a waste of time, as is the drawing. The photo shows where that bullet is, and it's not a lower. It's exactly where you expect that line to be if you are able to match it up to where Connelly is, as he's turning around, and it enters into, by the way, it's tumbling when it hits Connelly. You know, you say that Connelly was hit by a separate bullet from Oswald. The interesting thing about that, John, it's the entrance hole into Connelly. You know what that entrance hole was?
I've heard the tumbling theory, but that seems contrived and reverse engineered to me. But
you think the bullet just started to spin on its own because it decided to do so?
No, I want to go back to you citing Gerald. Hold on a second, Gerald. I want to make sure we nail down this autopsy issue.
The idea that Connelly was hit by anything but a bullet that had already struck something else.
Well, again, I'm open to that possibility, despite what you have already assessed my open-mindedness or lack thereof to be. But I want to go back, because when you cite Michael Bodden, that to me is a no-win situation, because Michael Bodden has turned out to be even worse than our inspector. He's a complete fraud. He's a whore. He's not a reliable person. I think you would be willing to acknowledge that.
But explain to me why his reading of the autopsy photo.
No, but I have never, Gerald, I have never seen a photo that indicates a hole in the back of Kennedy's neck, and I've seen autopsy photos that indicate something different, and I've certainly seen the holes in the back of the shirt and the jacket, and I've certainly seen the autopsy sketch, all of which are consistent with the same thing.
Big issue for you. Have you examined? Have you requested to examine? Ever? Have you made a request?
No, never have. But I would love to see it. I would love to see it. But here's another, because you've already done all the work, Gerald.
No. But you need to do it because it might change your view. Why?
Okay. Well, I would love to see a photograph as you described. But you mentioned the video. But Gerald, you mentioned the video. We have a video, and that is another problem with this entire neck throat wound situation. Do you believe that the Zapruder film shows JFK as was widely perceived, especially considering the fact that the first photographs that the public saw of this event was not a film? It was in Time Life magazine, where there was still photographs, which is very different than seeing a film, as you know. Do you believe that the Zapruder film shows JFK grabbing his throat? Do you believe that?
He's having a neurological response to the trauma of the bullet having passed through his neck. Whether he's grabbing at his throat, but his arms are going up and they're locked into this position. We know that they're locked because when Jackie Kennedy next to him, to the left of him, pushes down on his elbow, it doesn't go down easily. So he's having some form of a neurological response.
So you acknowledge he does not grab his throat?
I'm saying that it's a neurological response. And I don't know. I'm not in front of there, and I've never been able. We are only looking at the Zapruder film from an angle that's very difficult to tell. So I've never said that he's grabbing at his throat.
Because he doesn't grab his throat. He clenches his fists in what I agree with you is a neurological reaction, but I believe it's a delayed neurological reaction from being hit in the back a couple inches from his spine. You believe that that's somehow a neurological reaction from somehow missing the spinal cord going through the throat. And yet he does not, as is widely perceived at the time because of the photographs, he does not grab his throat. That's an important point, Gerald, because the perception of the grabbing of the throat is a huge part of how people interpret the wound at Parkland that gets made into the tracheotomy. Do you not agree with that perception?
I just can't imagine, as we're talking about this, how this issue, so critical to you, is one where you have just talked about it speculated about it, but haven't done the actual last bit of legwork to go and examine those autopsy photos yourself.
I saw the Zapruder film. He doesn't grab his throat.
You said they turned you down. If they wouldn't give you
Gerald,
access, you've been applying, you've appealed. That would be different. But
Gerald, I would be happy to look at anything you have that want to show me that shows. Okay, but you acknowledge that JFK does not grab his throat in the Zapruder film. You acknowledge that.
I don't acknowledge that because I don't know. I'm just saying he has a neurological response. His arms come up. He's grabbing at his throat. Maybe, I don't know, but I'm not saying he is. I'm not saying he's not. I just know his response is where the arms come up and they're locked.
Right. And because it's a neurological response that's delayed from, in my opinion, potentially the back wound that just lodges there and falls out, and which Paul Landis's testimony is consistent with, which I want to get to in just a second. But I don't want to leave the throat wound yet, okay? Because there's another piece of evidence that I've never heard you speak about. But as you know, there are many photographs of the assassination as it is happening. And maybe one of the most important is one that is from the perspective of being in front of the limousine, pointing back towards the school book depository building. The first shots have clearly already been fired. There's chaos in the limousine. And one of the many reasons that this photograph is important, by the way, do you know the photograph I'm referring to? This is a photograph that does not show a crack in the windshield yet, which is, as you know, very, very important because it proves, in my opinion, and I think you agree with this, the direction of the third shot, because
windshield. By the way, do you know Rosemary Willis?
No, I do not know Rosemary Willis. Why?
Okay, so I think that Rosemary Willis is a witness that you would enjoy reading about because she is your visual marker on the Zapruder film that the first shot, which you think hit Kennedy, actually missed entirely because she starts to turn around and react to that bullet at around frames 160, about 60 frames before.
Are you talking about the little girl?
Yeah.
The little, you and I agree that she is the marker for when the first shot was fired. I 100% agree with you, 100%. But that doesn't indicate that the shot was missed. That just means that it hit Kennedy sooner than we thought. There's no evidence that she saw a missed shot.
So what I don't understand then, so if you go through some...
Can I go back to the photograph, Gerald, because you didn't let me finish the point.
You mean that Kennedy just sits in the car, John, for 4 seconds?
It's not 4 seconds.
Yeah, it is. Frames 160 to 224.
No.
We're talking
because Kennedy goes, as you know, Kennedy is blocked by a road sign as he starts to react. And so
he goes into the road sign just sitting there and waving. So I guess he's been hit by a bullet but doesn't respond.
He gets hit. Well, I believe there was a delayed reaction. Now, we can argue about how long that delayed reaction is, but I want to go back to that photograph because this is critical to the throat wound situation. That photograph that shows no crack in the windshield, which is, I think, very important to proving that Oswald, or at least someone from the 6th floor of the school book depository building, fired the shot. It shows Kennedy. And you know what it doesn't show, Gerald? It doesn't show any sort of a wound from in his throat. There's no throat wound at that time. And based on you...
tie on, John. Okay. The bullet went through the shirt and tie. Have you examined the clothing?
And why is it? I really want to understand from your why. But Gerald, I'm well aware. Gerald, please, I'm on your side, Gerald.
No, you're not, John, because you're on the side of speculation, not on the side of evidence.
No. Please, you mentioned the holes in the tie and the shirt. Why are they so small? Why are they so incredibly small?
Because have you held that actual Carcano bullet?
The bullet is way larger than the holes in the tie. They're way larger.
No. That bullet has a pinpoint edge. Guess what? It's not a blunt edge. It's not a hollow point. And you know what it leaves, as a matter of fact? It's meant to go through somebody exactly like it does, because that's how they were developed.
It can't make a microscopic hole in a tie.
No. It leaves exactly what you would expect as a bullet of that size passing through at that point. And guess what? That's why you don't see the wound, John, because he has a shirt and tie on.
But there's another part of that story, of that photograph. And that gets me to the testimony of the people that were either in the limo or just near the limo, which is, I believe, very problematic for the single bullet theory. The first person I want to reference, since we're talking about the throat wound, and I'm very curious and very open-minded as to the explanation for this. I've never heard you speak about the testimony of Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman. And Roy Kellerman had been assigned to JFK for the entire 3 years of his presidency. And 3 or 4 days after the assassination, he testified to the FBI that he was positive that he heard Kennedy respond verbally to being hit. Now, how does that possibly, even knew what he said? He said, my God, I've been hit, which I think is interesting from a substance standpoint, given my theory. What is your explanation for how that is possible if JFK has already been hit through the throat? How is that possible?
I don't know how Kellerman comes up with that 3 or 4 days later, but I do know this. Jackie Kennedy confirmed that. Oh, no, hold on a second. She didn't. I'm sorry, she didn't. But you know who did? It was Connolly.
So you think Kellerman is lying?
No, Connolly confirmed that? No, he was wrong on other things. He was in shock. Mrs. Connolly, Nellie, must have confirmed that. No. She didn't either. Well, guess what? William Greer, the driver of the car, must have confirmed that. But he didn't confirm it. No, I think Kellerman, in his own shock, is he making up to cover for the fact that he says he heard Kennedy say that he was shot? And what was Kellerman's reaction? He's the lead Secret Service agent that day in Dallas, John. Does he jump over his seat onto the back of the car and throw his body on top of the president to save his life? Does he do everything possible that later happens when you should be trying to save the president? No, he doesn't get out of that seat. And he must have held his head in shame for a number of years over the fact that he doesn't react to actually try to get into the back to save the president. So his testimony is the testimony of an agent who didn't do what he was supposed to do.
Okay. Hey, look, I am more than willing, Gerald, I am more than willing to accept that someone may be grossly mistaken and or lying, but you acknowledge that he has to be grossly mistaken and or lying for the single bullet theory to still work.
Lying, he just has to be mistaken. And again, John, it goes
grossly mistaken.
Everybody in the car said, by the way, Jack Kennedy said when he was struck, oh my God, I can't believe they're shooting at me here in Dallas. I wonder why they're doing that. A long sentence like that. And then we later
That's not what he said. That's not what Kellerman testified to.
They all gave that testimony. Then the question is, did he say that? Or is it possible with the bullet that went through his, high neck throat and through his throat with the neurological response that he had, his head's blown out 5 seconds later. So he's got to say it's somewhere in there. But I don't know, nobody else says the same thing that Kellerman does. Kellerman heard that. I'm sure he's telling the truth. I don't think he's lying. I don't think any of those agents, even when they were wrong, certainly Connolly, who I think was wrong because he's about the sequence of shots, but he wasn't lying. He was telling it as he saw it.
Okay, so just to be clear, you need Connolly to be wrong and his wife to be wrong about the fact that in their estimation, their strong estimation, that the first shot was fired and that they believe that Kennedy and he were hit with different shots. You need Kellerman to be grossly mistaken about hearing Kennedy verbally respond to being shot. I'm also curious about your opinion of Clint Hill, a guy I know you have a lot of respect for. Clint Hill was the Secret Service agent who famously jumped on the back of the limousine to try to bring Jackie back into the limo. And he was always very, very clear that he associated the sound of the first shot with looking at the president and seeing JFK react. There was never any question in interpreting Clint Hill's testimony that the first shot hits JFK. That's a problem for you. You need him to be wrong too, don't you, Gerald?
What's interesting is you're relying on people who are reacting to the assassination of the President of the United States in real time. Is it possible that as opposed to being absolutely accurate in everything that they recall at that moment of trauma, there could be some mistakes? I say,
sure, there could be.
What's the best evidence?
But you need everyone to be mistaken. You need everyone. You need Hill, Kellerman. You need both Connollys to be wrong.
Thank goodness for the Zapruder film, and thank goodness for the autopsy photos and X-rays. Without that, we would have to go with their testimony. If the best evidence, John, was Kellerman's testimony and Hill's testimony,
I'm not saying it's the best. I'm saying it needs to be explained.
No. It's not that it's explained. It's trumped by better evidence, which is the autopsy photos, X-rays, and the Zapruder film. Now, if somebody thinks that the X-rays and photos have been faked, then they need to prove that. But the House Select Committee looked at whether they were tampered with.
Okay,
Those
so
are just
so
positive in this case.
okay, so just to review, you need the person
By
who
the
drew the
way,
odd.
John, one thing to know that even though the autopsy x-rays and photos show you that Kennedy was only struck from behind that day, okay, doesn't tell you if there was a single assassin. Could have been two.
Okay,
There could have been an assassin on the grassy knoll who fired and missed. It just tells you where the body was hit from that day. Doesn't tell you whether there was a conspiracy, multiple assassins, who was involved. People think often if you say that Kennedy was only hit from behind, you say it was a single bullet, as I believe, and then a headshot, you're saying it's Oswald alone. That's not true at all. You've just established where the shooter was who was successful. Now you have to determine who the shooter was and if there were other shooters there.
okay, I just want to review, so because we're running out of time, and you've been very patient with me, and I appreciate it very much. But you need the person who drew the autopsy sketch to be wrong. You need the shirt and the jacket to be bunched. You
I'm
need
not surprised.
you need
I'm not
Kellerman. You need
surprised.
hold on. You need Kellerman to be greatly mistaken. You need Clint Hill to be greatly mistaken. You need both Connellys to be greatly mistaken. So let's go to Paul Landis.
Yeah,
So
but hold
Paul
on.
Landis.
But again, when you say that, what you leave out at the end, it's not just a matter of going through that evidence. If that's the only evidence we
But
had,
I'm
10
not
days
suggesting you're. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that's what you
no, no,
need to be right.
no. I'm asking, not that I'm right. Is there better evidence? Go with the best evidence. And
Right.
that's what you have to do as an investigator.
And I've looked at the subvertitive 1,000 times because it's the best evidence. And I am not convinced that Connolly's reaction is not after JFK's, which is death for your theory.
National Archives to look at the X-rays and
Okay.
to look at the
Well,
photos.
I'm sorry I've not been to the National Archives. I would love to see whatever photos convinced you and Michael Baden that there was a shot that hit JFK in the neck that somehow the guy who wrote the sketch completely missed. But let's talk about Paul Landis, because this to me was, up until the Paul Landis book, just before the 50th anniversary of the assassination, I was no better than 50-50 on whether your theory or my theory carried more weight. I would go back and forth, maybe 60-40, depending on my mood. But when Paul Landis comes forward, and it's a weird story, I fully acknowledge this, but when he says he found 399, the so-called single bullet, in the back of the limo where JFK was sitting, which is way more consistent with my theory of that bullet falling out of JFK's back than it is coming to rest in John Connelly's thigh. I'm sorry, that to me is significant and pushes the preponderance of evidence in my direction. What is your way of interpreting Paul Landis that is still consistent with the single bullet theory?
Now, John, you're asking that as sort of a rhetorical question.
Oh, God.
What I mean is, have you read my update for the 60th anniversary?
I have heard you talk. I've heard you talk about your interpretation of Landis's story, which I don't find that convincing, but I want to hear it from you directly.
Landis is the key to CE 399 and the single bullet.
Okay.
I explained it in my chapter.
So why don't you tell us your version of how that happens?
I rely upon what he said. He did find that bullet. We now know how it ended up on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. And I'm surprised you haven't read it, because I go through this in detail, line by line, of what he said. As a matter of fact, and compare it to other witnesses. He did, in fact, find the bullet. We now know that. I believe that it was not a story that he made up all of a sudden 60 years later, because Clint Hill told me that he had talked to other agents about that beforehand. And as a matter of fact, when Connelly is taken out of the car, should look, I cite those photographs, as a matter of fact, from the Dallas reporters who are around there. When they take Connelly out, they go up to him at Parkland Hospital, the emergency crew. Guess who they're worried about? They're worried about the president. That's who they want to get out. Connelly's a big, tall guy. He's in that front little seat. And you know how they get him out? You should see some of those pictures. They turn Connelly around. They've got his legs up like this. The bullet that we all thought popped out on the stretcher when Connelly was brought into the emergency room pops out in that car. And Paul Landis, as a young Secret Service agent, finds it. And he makes the fatal mistake of putting it in his pocket and then going into the emergency room, and he's watching Kennedy being worked on. Where Landis later says, I put it at the feet of the president. He didn't, because the president at that point was not left alone. But what he did do, as he was leaving that, and what he told Clint Hill, and he told other agents, and I report that in my update, is as he was leaving the hospital, he panicked and he didn't know what they were going to do. And he dropped it on a stretcher in that hallway. And guess what? There were two stretchers we now know. One of them was the stretcher Connelly was brought in on, which they brought down and left in the hallway. The other stretcher was a 14-year-old kid who had been involved in an accident, who arrived there at emergency, and they put that stretcher over the side. The Warren Commission made a mistake. They said afterward, gee, when the head of maintenance bumped into into the stretcher, and the bullet fell on the floor, and that turned out to be CE 399, they looked at the two stretchers and they said, well, one of them is Connelly's. So it must have been on Connelly's. That must have popped out when they were working on it, and they took him off the stretcher to the emergency room hospital bed. Guess what? We don't know that. As a matter of fact, it's possible that Landis just plopped it on the stretcher without knowing it of the 14-year-old kid who had been brought in. But what we know for sure is that we have now a chain of custody, as flawed as it is, that would have been attacked inside a courtroom. And that is that Paul Landis has finally explained how that bullet ended up on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. Didn't pop out of Connelly's thigh. It popped out essentially when he was being wrestled out of the car. It was found by Landis, who made the mistake of putting it on a stretcher. And there it was found afterwards when the head of maintenance bumps into it. Landis's testimony is the final bit of evidence to figure out how the single bullet ended up as CE 399.
Gerald, I think this is the weakest part of your argument, because hold on a second. This is what you're asking us to believe. So instead of Occam's razor, where the bullet is found in the back of the limousine that falling out of JFK's back, where the autopsy sketch indicates there was a hole.
The photos show. You're out of date. You're 60 years out of
date. Gerald, would you let me just finish what you this is important, because this is what you're asking us to believe. You're asking us to, Gerald, can you
but you know what? You are smarter than this. You're smarter not to follow the evidence. You're smarter.
Gerald, I'm following you 100%. I want people to understand what you're asking us to believe. You're asking us to believe. Gerald, we're on.
Photographs from the autopsy show that is not the case.
Okay.
It's like saying, by the way, I looked at the World Trade Center.
Right.
It was up, and then after 9/11, it was down. And you're saying, no, I think it's still up.
No, because we have video of that. But hold on.
We have autopsy photos here.
Okay, Gerald, I want people to understand, and I want you to fully acknowledge what you're asking people to believe with regard to the Paul Landis testimony. So you believe Landis, but this is what happens. So the so-called magic pristine bullet is in Connelly. It drops out in the back of the limousine where Kennedy was sitting, because they're dragging Connelly's body out, and it just happens to fall out of his thigh right where Kennedy was. Then it gets, hold on a second. It then gets picked.
Do you know what the speed was when it went into Connelly's thigh?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because what you're asking, Gerald, what you're asking, hold on, Gerald, please.
You don't know the facts on this, John. This is why you're behind the eight
ball. Gerald, the bullet, I'm granting you all sorts of benefit of the doubt. I just want people to understand what you're saying. So the bullet falls out right where JFK was. It gets picked up by Landis. Landis brings it into the operating room of JFK, because he's presuming, because he found it in the back of the limo, that this was a bullet that hit JFK. He tries to leave it on JFK's stretcher, but accidentally leaves it on a stretcher that would later be determined to be Connelly's stretcher, therefore somehow coming back full circle to the guy whose body the bullet was in to begin with. That is a bonkers story.
John, you missed my point. It wasn't Connelly's stretcher. The stretcher.
It doesn't. But it was mistaken as Connelly's stretcher. So you're saying
Connelly's stretcher was in that hallway, and the Warren Commission made the mistake of assuming it had to come from Connelly's stretcher.
Okay.
They could never have imagined that a Secret Service agent had picked up the bullet and then dropped it on a stretcher.
Well, but Gerald, forgive me if for years I have always theorized that they screwed up on whose stretcher that was. And so forgive me when Landis's story comes out and he finds a bullet exactly where JFK is, and it's consistent with my theory that they didn't really know whose stretcher that bullet was found on, that I somehow look at this and go, wait a minute, that's way more consistent with my theory than with the single bullet theory. But look, I frankly, Gerald, with all due respect, I think that your interpretation of Landis is the worst example of potential reversed engineered thinking, because you need a result, and therefore you're coming up with this contrived. You talk about speculation. I mean, this is pure speculation about what they did with Connelly's body and how the bullet dropped out of him.
I wrote a Substack initially. You have to be willing. I always say follow the evidence.
I'm happy to look at whatever you want me to look at. Happy to look at whatever. All right, last question.
Written about Landis. I thought that he was not credible. I wrote a Substack that questioned why he was coming out so late with this story, and I didn't think it was right. It was only after I spoke to Clint Hill and had conversations with him, and he explained to me Landis, and that I started to understand it, because initially I thought Landis was lying or false, and then I came to believe him. And that John, all I can say is it's only a 12 or 13 page section that I've added to Case Closed. It's not that long, and if you read it,
But Gerald, I already know what your theory is.
I know, but
I already know what your theory is, Gerald. And frankly, I think you came to believe Landis because you came up with a scenario, as creative as it is, that is consistent with your theory, which is the definition of reverse engineering. But okay,
it's the way it happens. So
okay,
let me ask you a question. If
sure.
Landis had found that bullet in
Where Connelly was, I would have said I'm wrong.
no.
I would have said I'm wrong. I would have. See, that's the difference between the two of us, Gerald. I would have said I'm wrong.
Get an idea from the people that took Connelly out how they handled him.
No. Although this is a very important point. If Paul Landis had said, you know what, I found a bullet where Governor Connelly was, and I brought it into the hospital, I would say, oh my God, the single bullet theory is correct. I'm wrong. 399 was found with Connelly, not with JFK.
You really have to read my update.
Well, I just heard you talk about it. I've heard you talk about it many times. All right, last question, Gerald. I want to end on some common ground here because
I'm surprised in some ways, John, that you're asking me about that without having taken the 10 minutes to have read it.
Because I've seen you talk about it.
Yeah, but is that a little different than? I mean, it's just.
You're the real McCoy. I'm asking you about it right now. You can't change the nature of your theory.
Right questions.
Okay, last question, because I really believe there's a solution to this, and I want to understand from you why this has not happened yet, or maybe it could actually still happen in the future, because you're the one guy I think might have the influence to make it happen. It's very simple. Why has there never been legitimate DNA testing on 399? Because in my view, we're only going to find JFK's DNA on 399 and not Connelly's. If we find both, the entire case is cracked. Why can't we get DNA testing with the advances in DNA testing and trace DNA on 399?
I'd like to see every form of test applied. I'd love to see DNA testing applied. And I guarantee you, John, if DNA testing was done and tomorrow showed Kennedy's blood and Connelly's blood, it's not going to change the mind of anybody.
It would change my mind. It would change my mind in a heartbeat. But
it's not going to change. They would all think it's planted. They would all think that was done. Rest assured, if you had a video of Oswald doing the shooting,
have you ever come out in favor of DNA testing for 399?
All the time. I want every form of testing that's
possible. So why hasn't it been done? Why hasn't it been done?
You'll have to ask the government why they held on to documents for 60 years that should have been released 40 years ago. The government's been its own worst enemy on this case time and again for lack of transparency.
Okay, but would you agree that if there was DNA testing on 399, the so-called magic bullet, that based upon modern technology, we should be able to discern whether or not JFK and or Connelly's DNA is on there? Do you agree with that, right?
So I handled that bullet, and I'm just one of dozens of historians and researchers have handed over time. And having gloves, it's held by the National Archives. They take it out.
You weren't wearing gloves, by the way? You weren't wearing gloves?
I wasn't able to hold it. It's held by somebody at the archives.
Okay.
They hold it for
you. And they have gloves on, right?
They have gloves on and everything else. That's right. So are we to believe that after 60 years, that chain of custody is good enough? Let's do the DNA testing and find out.
Well, I would be thrilled. And I have to tell you, Gerald, despite the fact that you think I'm not open-minded, I would be the first person, if there was Connelly's DNA on that bullet, to say, I am wrong. The single bullet theory is correct. Gerald Posner deserves even more credit that he already got for Case Closed, which you already know, I believe, is the preeminent book on the assassination. I would be thrilled because then this would be finally put to bed and we would know the truth of it. And to me, this is an incredibly simple solution that ought to happen.
Know the truth of it without the DNA testing, but if it's going to take DNA testing to bring you over, let's do it.
Well, can you please try to make this happen?
I wish I had that power. I can't even get documents released that I keep applying for all the time. I'm in line with everybody else.
Okay. Gerald, I really appreciate your time. I'm sorry that you think that somehow I'm not open-minded or that I am being cross with you, because I'm really just trying to figure out the truth.
I don't think you're being cross with me. I like a good discussion. You're always good, John, for a good discussion. You argue, your point of view very, very well, and you have a strong enough viewpoint and understanding of the issues that when I come back hard on you, you don't back off. You give me the discussion. I like that. People nowadays assume if you have a hard debate one way or the other, they think you're being rude to each other because they're not used to hard debates. This is the
True.
way that real discussions are. You've got a position, I've got a position. We argue it hard. We each advocate for it. I'm telling you should look at this, and you're telling me we should do the DNA testing. But that's what I enjoy about a good discussion, because it's done respectfully on both sides. So I have no problem with having that debate with you.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that, because I think I have enormous respect for your research, not just on JFK, but on other subjects as well. And I will always have reverence for Case Closed. And so thank you so much for your time. It's always great to talk to you, Gerald.
Let me tell you, it's great to talk to you. And I should be so lucky to be able to talk to people about the JFK assassination and